Africa has done what few believe possible. In a single stroke, three nations tore their names from the pages of the International Criminal Court, and with it, they tore open the illusion of universal justice. For decades, The Hague wore the mask of neutrality, yet its gaze seemed fixed on one continent. Europe's wars were forgotten. America's invasions went unpunished. But Africa was hunted, case by case, leader by leader, as if the soil itself was guilty. On the morning of 23 September 2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger spoke with one voice. They did not whisper. They did not hesitate. They declared that the black robes of Europe would no longer decide the fate of African sons and daughters. This was not diplomacy. It was defiance. And it is a defiance that may redraw the map of justice itself. Do not look away. What comes next is bigger than a courtroom. It is the future of sovereignty. Stay with us. Subscribe and walk this journey together. The morning of 23 September 2025 did not begin with the quiet rhythm of diplomacy. It began with a rupture. In the capitals of Ouagadougou, at Bamako and Niamey, statements were read aloud not in the cautious tones of lawyers, but in the commanding cadence of generals. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were no longer members of the International Criminal Court. The words carried no hesitation, no promise of review, no committees to study the matter. It was a clean break, a cut sharp enough to slice through years of uneasy compromise. The symbolism could not be overstated. This was not an obscure technical adjustment to a treaty. It was not a footnote buried in the bureaucratic diary of international relations. It was three sovereign nations stepping outside the orbit of one of the world's most celebrated courts, and in doing so, calling that court itself into question. The ICC had always presented itself as a universal guardian of justice, an impartial referee standing above nations. Yet on that day, Africa turned the mirror around. The hunter became the hunted. The accuser stood accused. To grasp the gravity of this decision, one must remember the shadow that the ICC had cast over the Sahel. For years, its presence was like a storm cloud, hovering over leaders, soldiers, and citizens alike. The prospect of investigations into the conduct of local armies was not theoretical. It was imminent. Every counterinsurgency operation risked becoming the subject of a case file in The Hague. For governments already battling for survival against insurgents and for the loyalty of their people, the idea of facing external prosecutors felt less like oversight and more like strangulation. The joint announcement cut through that fear. It was framed not as an act of evasion, but as an act of emancipation. Your courtroom is not our destiny, the statement implied. The imagery was unmistakable. The ICC was depicted as a colonial tool, a European invention disguised as universal morality. To remain within its jurisdiction was, in the eyes of the Sahel states, to accept a permanent subordination of African sovereignty to foreign robes and foreign gavels. What shocked observers in Brussels and Washington was the decisiveness of the move. Many expected ambiguity, perhaps a review process, perhaps months of diplomatic wrangling. Instead, they received clarity. The leaders of these three nations did not hedge. They walked out. In international affairs, clarity is often more disruptive than confrontation. Because with clarity comes precedent. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could leave without immediate collapse, why not Kenya? Why not Ethiopia? Why not South Africa? What looked at first like a regional act of rebellion soon appeared as a possible template for continental defiance. The timing made the announcement all the more striking. These were not prosperous democracies enjoying peace. They were nations in turmoil, battered by insurgencies, governed by juntas that themselves had come to power through force of arms. In such fragile circumstances, many assumed they would cling tightly to international legitimacy, seeking recognition in the eyes of Europe and the United Nations. Instead, they rejected that recognition wholesale. In their reasoning, legitimacy no longer flowed from external approval. It flowed from sovereignty itself, from the will to defend their soil without apology. The reaction at home underscored this logic. Crowds did not mourn the loss of ICC membership. They celebrated it. For citizens who had long watched foreign courts summon African leaders while ignoring Western ones, the move felt like an affirmation of dignity. It was, in their view, a declaration that African soldiers would not be criminalized for defending African lives in wars ignited by external interventions. Justice, the message ran, would no longer be flown in from Europe like cargo. It would be planted in African ground, watered by African struggles, and harvested in African seasons. The withdrawal also revealed a deeper frustration. that Africa had been treated not as a partner in global justice, but as its perpetual subject. The ICC's record in Africa was no secret. From Uganda to Kenya, from Sudan to Libya, the indictments stacked up almost exclusively on one continent. The absences were just as telling. The invasion of Iraq, the collapse of Libya, civilian casualties in Afghanistan. None of these ever reached the docket of The Hague. The scales of justice, it seemed, weighed heavily on one side of the world. By walking away, the Sahel states did more than defend their armies. They challenged the very narrative of who gets to define justice. Their decision implied a larger claim, that true justice cannot be imposed from afar, especially not by those who have shielded themselves from the very laws they impose on others. If sovereignty is to mean anything, it must mean the right to define accountability on one's own soil. And yet this bold act raises a troubling question. If not the ICC, then what? If international law is rejected, what system will emerge in its place? Will Africa craft a new mechanism of justice, rooted in its own traditions and realities? Or will the absence of external scrutiny create a vacuum where impunity thrives unchecked? The world is watching, and the answer may determine not only the future of the Sahel, but the future of justice itself. What transforms a decision into a turning point is not only what was done, but how it was received. The withdrawal of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger from the International Criminal Court was not met with silence. It struck like a thunderclap, reverberating far beyond the Sahel. In one announcement, the ICC was no longer simply an institution. It was the defendant. It stood accused of hypocrisy, partiality, and of carrying within its marble halls the lingering shadow of empire. For ordinary Africans, this reversal was electrifying. For years, they had watched as headlines announced yet another African leader summoned to The Hague. They had witnessed indictments that dragged on for years, eroding reputations without securing convictions. And they had asked again and again why leaders in Washington or Paris, whose wars left entire regions in ruins, were never called to account. On the morning of the announcement, that question found its answer. The Sahel had refused to play along. The mask was off. The hunter's rifle was turned back upon itself. In Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, the mood was defiant. Crowds poured into streets, not to protest, but to celebrate. National radio stations carried voices that spoke of dignity, of pride, of a long-awaited rupture with the past. In their telling, this was not the isolation of Africa. It was the liberation of Africa from isolation. The isolation of being the sole target of international justice, while others stood immune. Not charity, not pity, sovereignty. These were the rhythms that echoed across public squares and airwaves. The emotional resonance was amplified by the context of war. For citizens who lived under the constant threat of insurgent attacks, whose fields were mined and whose families displaced, the ICC was not a source of comfort. It was a source of suspicion. How could a distant court thousands of kilometers away claim to deliver justice when it had never shielded them from violence? How could a tribunal in Europe judge the sons of the Sahel who died defending their villages while ignoring the foreign interventions that helped ignite the conflict in the first place? To many, the withdrawal was not a retreat from justice. It was a reclamation of justice. But if the mood at home was celebratory, the mood abroad was unsettled. In Brussels, diplomats fretted over the precedent. In Washington, analysts warned of the erosion of international law. In Paris, the reaction was tinged with fear. If even the Sahel could walk away, how long before others followed? The ICC's defenders issued statements insisting that justice must not be selective, that the institution was striving toward universality. Yet these words landed with less weight than before, because the accusation had already been made, and it had been made not by critics in academia, but by states themselves. Regional organizations watched with interest. The African Union had long voiced skepticism about the ICC's bias. ECOWAS, though preoccupied with security crises, recognized that a realignment was underway. If 3 of its member states could defy The Hague, what did that mean for the bloc's collective diplomacy? Would others be compelled to defend them, or would silence imply tacit agreement with the critique? The questions rippled outward, unsettling the fragile equilibrium between African institutions and Western power. Media outlets captured the drama. In Western capitals, editorials warned of dangerous impunity and juntas shielding themselves from scrutiny. In African outlets, the tone was different. Headlines celebrated the move as a long overdue assertion of dignity. The same event was thus narrated in 2 languages, one of fear, the other of freedom. The divergence revealed not only a political split, but a cultural one, a chasm between how justice is perceived in Europe and how it is experienced in Africa. The confrontation reached its emotional peak in the framing of the decision itself. Leaders of the Sahel did not portray their exit as an act of cowardice or concealment. They framed it as an act of rebellion, rebellion against double standards, rebellion against the silencing of African voices, rebellion against a system that expected compliance without respect. The repetition was deliberate, rhythmic, and powerful. Not compliance, not silence, defiance. It was a message directed not only at the ICC, but at every institution that claimed universality while operating through selective enforcement. If the ICC could be defied, why not others? Why not the IMF with its conditionalities, or the World Bank with its demands? Why not NATO, whose interventions had reshaped the region? Once the spell of inevitability was broken, nothing appeared untouchable. If 3 nations in the Sahel can stand together and reject the weight of international justice, what stops 5 more tomorrow? What happens if South Africa, Nigeria, or Ethiopia, giants of the continent, choose to follow? The tremor that began in the Sahel may yet become an earthquake. The decision to leave the International Criminal Court was not only a legal rupture, it carried with it consequences that reached into villages, markets, and the fragile political balance of the Sahel. For ordinary citizens, the implications were immediate, if not always clear. What mattered most was not the paperwork of treaties, but how the decision would shape their daily struggle for survival. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, war has become the rhythm of life. Entire provinces have been scarred by insurgency. Farmers hesitate to sow their fields, fearing that explosives lie buried beneath the soil. Families flee in the night, abandoning homes that have stood for generations. Refugee camps swell on the edges of towns, their tents a stark reminder of displacement. The toll of the conflict already rivaled some of the world's worst crises. To these communities, international courts offered little solace. What they demanded was security, the right to live without the constant threat of violence. This is why the withdrawal from the ICC resonated so deeply. It was perceived not as a technical matter of law, but as a statement of priorities. Justice, in the eyes of the Sahel states, begins with sovereignty. Sovereignty is not an abstract concept. It is the right of a farmer to cultivate his land without fear. It is the right of a mother to send her children to school without the sound of gunfire. It is the right of soldiers, drawn from those same communities, to defend their homeland without being treated as criminals by distant judges in Europe. The political consequences were just as profound. Each of the 3 nations is governed by a military junta that came to power through upheaval. In Burkina Faso, the rise of Ibrahim Traoré in 2022 was itself the result of deep frustration with insecurity and foreign dependence. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of a sentiment that foreign-backed democracies had failed to deliver stability. In rejecting the ICC, these juntas reinforced that narrative. They positioned themselves not as usurpers clinging to power, but as defenders of dignity standing against outside interference. Domestically, this posture strengthened their legitimacy. Crowds that might otherwise question military rule found themselves rallying around the flag. The move provided a sense of unity in societies fractured by war. It offered the promise, however fragile, that sovereignty could be reclaimed not by permission from abroad, but by decision at home. In the volatile politics of the Sahel, such symbolism is a powerful tool. Yet the decision also carried risks. By stepping outside the ICC, the states exposed themselves to accusations of impunity. Critics warned that without external oversight, there was a danger that abuses by security forces would go unchecked. Already reports had surfaced of heavy-handed tactics in counterinsurgency campaigns. Villages burned, suspects executed without trial, civilians caught in the crossfire. Without the prospect of international accountability, would these patterns worsen? Or would the very act of claiming sovereignty compel the states to build their own systems of justice, rooted in local traditions and realities? For the international community, the move complicated an already delicate engagement with the Sahel. Western powers had justified military aid and humanitarian support in part as measures to uphold international law. With the ICC cast aside, that justification grew weaker. Would aid be reduced? Would sanctions follow? Or would the West find itself forced to engage on new terms, recognizing that sovereignty was now non-negotiable? Each scenario carried its own set of consequences for civilians, whose livelihoods depended on external assistance as much as on local governance. The truth is that in the Sahel, law and survival are inseparable. To speak of justice while ignoring insecurity is to miss the point. To insist on oversight without acknowledging sovereignty is to repeat the mistakes of the past. The withdrawal from the ICC revealed this paradox in stark relief. It was not a retreat into lawlessness. It was a demand that the law be rooted in the soil of Africa, not imported from marble halls and ocean away. Still, the question lingers like an echo over the desert winds. Can sovereignty alone guarantee stability? If international recognition is withdrawn, if aid is reduced, if the spotlight of global justice dims, will these nations find strength in self-reliance or collapse under the weight of isolation? The answer will shape not only the fate of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, but the future of Africa's relationship with the very idea of justice. The reverberations of the Sahel's decision did not end at its borders. In Washington, the announcement was greeted with alarm. Officials warned that the withdrawal undermined the rule of law, feeding narratives of impunity. European capitals echoed the concern. Brussels, long a champion of the ICC, framed the move as a direct challenge to the credibility of international institutions. Paris, already bruised by the expulsion of its troops from the Sahel, saw it as another step in the erosion of French influence across its former colonies. Yet beyond the corridors of Western power, the tone was strikingly different. In Addis Ababa, headquarters of the African Union, the decision was read less as an aberration and more as a continuation of a long-standing grievance. The AU had often criticized the ICC for its selective prosecutions, and its leaders had debated creating an African alternative. Now, with 3 states acting in unison, that debate carried new urgency. Could the withdrawal of the Sahel trio ignite a broader continental realignment? Would other African nations, long skeptical of The Hague, finally follow through on their threats to leave? Meanwhile, new partners stepped into the space left vacant by Western disapproval. Moscow praised the assertion of sovereignty, framing it as evidence of Africa's place in an emerging multipolar order. Beijing offered quiet support, emphasizing principles of non-interference and mutual respect. Ankara signaled its willingness to deepen military and economic ties. In each case, the message was clear. If the West used international courts as levers of influence, others stood ready to offer alternatives without such conditions. The symbolism of this pivot was profound. The International Criminal Court, once a symbol of universality, was exposed as vulnerable to rejection. The very idea of global justice mediated through Western design institutions now appeared fragile. In its place, a new narrative began to emerge. One of justice rooted in sovereignty, of dignity defended not through compliance, but through defiance. For many, it evoked the spirit of a Burkina Faso revolution, a broader continental uprising against structures of control disguised as law, and yet the implications remain uncertain. If Africa does turn away from the ICC, what comes next? Will an African court of sovereign justice rise under the auspices of the African Union, blending modern legal frameworks with indigenous traditions? Will Western powers accept such an institution as legitimate, or will they dismiss it as a shield for authoritarianism? The world stands at a crossroads. The Sahel has spoken. The question is whether others will answer, and whether justice itself will look the same once they do. The decision to leave the International Criminal Court was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter whose contours are still uncertain. The road ahead for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is paved with both risk and possibility, and the choices they make will shape not only their own destiny, but the image of Africa on the world stage. One path leads toward renewal. By rejecting imported systems of accountability, the Sahel states have created space to imagine alternatives rooted in their own traditions. Justice could be redefined through community reconciliation, hybrid courts, and regional frameworks that reflect African realities rather than European abstractions. Seeds of such ideas have already been planted. Truth-telling commissions led by elders, reparations that rebuild rather than simply punish, local hearings that give victims a voice. If cultivated, these seeds may grow into an indigenous model of justice that restores dignity where foreign tribunals have failed. Another path, however, leads toward isolation. Without international oversight, critics fear abuses could multiply unchecked. Allegations of heavy-handed counterinsurgency already shadow the Sahel's armies. Without the discipline of external scrutiny, the temptation to rule by force rather than law could deepen. Aid may shrink, sanctions may tighten. In such a scenario, sovereignty would feel less like freedom and more like abandonment. Between these extremes lies the delicate work of balance. Sovereignty is not an excuse for impunity, nor is international justice an excuse for domination. The challenge facing the Sahel is to prove that it can uphold the former without descending into the latter. It is to demonstrate that African soldiers can defend their homelands while African institutions hold them accountable, not out of submission to The Hague, but out of loyalty to their own people. The symbolism of this moment is undeniable. For too long, Africa has been told that law must flow from Europe to be legitimate. By charting their own path, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are asserting the opposite, that justice can germinate in African soil, watered by African struggles, and harvested by African hands. They are declaring that sovereignty is not merely the right to resist, but the right to rebuild. Still, the question lingers. Will this bold defiance inspire others to join, creating a continental wave of transformation? Or will it leave the Sahel standing alone, caught between pride and peril? The road ahead is uncertain, but one truth is clear. The map of justice has already shifted, and the world will be watching to see where that road leads. The departure of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger from the International Criminal Court was not simply a legal withdrawal. It was a declaration that sovereignty cannot be negotiated away, that dignity cannot be measured in European chambers, and that justice cannot be outsourced to those who never judge themselves. In walking away, the Sahel has not abandoned justice. It has reclaimed ownership of justice. For Burkina Faso in particular, this moment continues the arc that began with the Ibrahim Traoré coup. When Traoré seized power, he did so under the banner of restoring security and independence. Now, by rejecting the ICC, his government is extending that banner into the realm of law and morality. The message is consistent. Sovereignty first, sovereignty always. It is this stance that has transformed the move into something larger than law, into the heartbeat of a movement that some are calling nothing less than a Burkina Faso revolution. But revolutions are not judged on declarations alone. They are judged on what follows. Will the Sahel build systems of accountability strong enough to silence accusations of impunity? Will it prove to the world that justice rooted in African soil can be both credible and compassionate? Or will the absence of oversight open the door to excess, eroding the very dignity it sought to protect? The stakes could not be higher, because if this bold act fails, it will be cited as proof that Africa cannot govern its own conscience. If it succeeds, it will mark the dawn of a new era, where the continent is no longer a subject of history, but its author. And so the question remains, is this the final echo of the Ibrahim Traoré coup, or is it the opening line of Africa's new story? The answer will not come from The Hague. It will come from the people of the Sahel, from the choices they make, from the justice they build with their own hands. If you believe this story matters, share your voice below. Leave a comment, subscribe, and walk with us into the future Africa is daring to write.